The Grand Canyon has always been a place of wonder, a vast open space that stretches beyond the horizon, like the spine of the earth cracked open to reveal its ancient bones. Tourists come and go, snapping pictures, marveling at the sheer size, the colors that shift with the sun, the quiet majesty of it all. But for me, it's more than a scenic view, more than a geological masterpiece. The canyon isn't just a place, it's a living being, an ancient spirit that has witnessed time in a way no human ever could. It's a place where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual world thins, almost as if you could step between them if you knew where to look. I come from a family rooted in Cherokee traditions, though like many others, we've been scattered across different parts of the country. My ancestors were not from the lands around the canyon, but the connection we feel to the earth, to the spirits that live within the land, has no borders. My grandfather was the one who truly carried the old ways, the stories, the songs, the knowledge that was passed down through generations. He believed, as his ancestors did, that the earth was alive, that the mountains, rivers, and forests were inhabited by spirits far older than humanity. As a child, I thought of these stories as fairy tales. Beautiful, poetic, but not real in any concrete sense. They were something we told ourselves to feel closer to our heritage, or so I thought. Years ago, my family made a decision that would change the course of my life in ways I couldn't have imagined at the time. We moved closer to the Grand Canyon, driven not by the usual reasons like work or a change of scenery, but by a sense of calling. My mother said she dreamed of the canyon before we moved, vivid dreams where she was walking its trails, feeling the rough stone under her fingers. My father, who wasn't one to talk about spiritual matters, simply said he felt like it was time to go west. I was skeptical, dismissive even, chalking it up to a midlife crisis or a desire for a fresh start, but the pull they felt, it was real, and so we went. As we settled into our new home, I began spending more and more time in the canyon. At first, it was just a place to hike, to get away from the noise of the world. I'd take long walks, losing myself in the vast silence that surrounded me, the only sounds being the wind and the occasional cry of an eagle. It wasn't long before I began to feel something different, something I couldn't easily explain. It was as if the canyon was watching me, observing me the way I was observing it. It sounds strange, I know, but there were moments when I felt an almost physical presence, like a hand on my shoulder or the gaze of eyes I couldn't see. I remembered the stories my grandfather used to tell, stories about Avad, or Abduka, as he sometimes called it, the guardian spirit of the canyon. According to him, this spirit wasn't benevolent or malevolent in the way we usually think. It was a protector, a keeper of the balance, ensuring that the land remained in harmony. I'll never forget the day I decided to go on a solo hike, deeper into the canyon than I had ever gone before. It was early morning when I set out, the sun just beginning to light up the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the dusty aroma of the canyon walls. As I descended into the heart of the canyon, the silence became profound, almost palpable. There's a certain kind of quiet that exists only in places untouched by man, a quiet that feels heavy with the weight of time. I felt small, insignificant, as if I were walking through the bones of a giant. Hours passed, and I found myself far from any trail, surrounded by rock formations that twisted and turned like frozen waves. I sat down to rest, letting the solitude wash over me. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, nearly invisible, but unmistakable once you saw them. They were larger than any human footprint I had ever seen, and the toes were long, almost claw-like. My rational mind tried to make sense of it. Perhaps it was a bear or some trick of the light on the stone, but deep down I knew better. I could feel it. The air had changed, growing colder, heavier. It was the same feeling I had when my grandfather used to tell his stories about Avad. It was as if the spirit itself was there, watching, waiting. I kept moving, but my pace was slower now, my senses heightened. Every sound seemed amplified. The rustle of a leaf, the crunch of gravel underfoot, even the sound of my own breathing. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that danced across the canyon walls. I should have turned back, but something kept pulling me deeper in. It was a magnetic feeling, like I was being drawn toward something or someone. I found a small alcove and decided to set up camp for the night. I built a small fire, hoping its light would drive away the unease I felt creeping into my bones. As the flames flickered, casting shadows against the rock, I heard it, a soft rustling sound like fabric brushing against stone. I looked up and there it was, a tall figure standing at the edge of the firelight. It was hard to make out any details. It seemed to blend in with the shadows, its form shifting with the movements of the flames. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I knew, without a doubt, that this was Avad, the guardian spirit of the canyon. We stood there locked in a silent standoff. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I felt like a child again, listening to my grandfather's stories, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small amulet my grandfather had given me years ago. He said it was a charm for protection, something his own grandfather had made. I held it up and whispered the words I could barely remember, the words of respect he had taught me in our native tongue. My voice was shaky, barely more than a whisper, but I spoke them anyway. The figure seemed to listen, tilting its head slightly, almost curiously. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. The air grew warmer, the tension easing, but I was left sitting there, staring into the darkness, my mind racing. What had I just witnessed? Was it a spirit? A figment of my imagination? Or something else entirely? I sat there for hours, unable to move, until the sky began to lighten with the dawn. When I finally made my way back up the canyon, I felt different, like a part of me had been left behind. I looked back once, and there, in the dust of the path, were fresh footprints, large, claw-like, leading deeper into the canyon. It was as if the spirit had left a parting gift, a reminder of our encounter. I arrived home, exhausted and bewildered, and told my family what had happened. My mother listened in silence, her face expressionless. My father nodded as if he had expected something like this to happen. But it was my grandfather's reaction that struck me the most. He simply smiled, a small, knowing smile, and said, "You met him. You met the true guardian of the canyon." He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He knew. He understood in a way I was only beginning to grasp. In that moment, everything changed for me. The stories I had dismissed as legends or myths were real. The land was alive, and the spirits were watching. And for the first time, I truly understood what it meant to be a part of this world, to be connected to something far greater than myself. As the years passed, the stories I once thought were mere legends became a part of me, intertwined with the very fabric of my being. My own encounter in the canyon was only the beginning. I realized that I was not alone in my experience. Others had walked these paths before me, had felt the same presence, the same gaze of the spirit guardians who have watched over the land for centuries. Among those who carried these stories was Notley, a respected elder within our tribe. Notley was different from anyone I had ever met. They seemed to exist in two worlds at once, the tangible modern world that we all live in, and the unseen world of spirits and ancestors, a place most of us only glimpse in dreams. Notley wasn't just an elder in the traditional sense. They were a keeper of our stories, a bridge between the past and the present. Whenever they spoke, it felt like the voice of the earth itself was speaking through them. They knew the land intimately, as though they had walked every inch of it, not just in this life, but in many lives before. I remember sitting with Notley around the fire one night, the air thick with the smell of sage and the distant sound of drumming carried on the wind. They spoke slowly, their voice deep and resonant, telling us of a place they called Spirit Gorge, a secluded part of the Grand Canyon known only to a few. It was a place where the boundary between the living world and the spirit world was thin, almost translucent. It was said that the spirits of the old shamanic protectors lingered there, guardians of a sacred power that ran through the earth like an invisible river. Notley's eyes shone with a distant light as they recalled their own journey to Spirit Gorge. It was not a place one could find on a map. It was hidden, protected by the land itself, as if it chose who could enter. Notley had gone there many years ago, seeking guidance and clarity during a difficult time. They described the journey vividly, the steep descent into the canyon, the way the light seemed to change as they got closer to the gorge, taking on a strange bluish hue that didn't match the sun's position in the sky. The air became heavy, almost humid, carrying a scent that wasn't quite recognizable, like a mix of ancient pine and something floral, something otherworldly. When Notley reached Spirit Gorge, they felt a profound sense of stillness, a quiet so deep it pressed against their ears, making every breath sound like a roar. They had come to perform a purification ritual, an ancient practice passed down through countless generations, designed to cleanse the soul and open the mind to the voices of the ancestors. Notley knelt on the ground, laying out the sacred items: a bundle of white sage, a small polished stone from the river, and a single black feather. They lit the sage, letting the smoke curl upward, twisting and spiraling like a living thing. As they began to chant, the words of the old language flowing effortlessly from their lips, the wind picked up, swirling around them, carrying the smoke high into the sky. It was then that the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew colder, and a shadow passed overhead, though there was no cloud in the sky. Notley paused, listening, and in the silence that followed, they heard it. A soft, whispering sound, like voices speaking in unison, but in a language that was older than time. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the canyon walls, creating a symphony of voices that rose and fell like waves. Notley knew these were the voices of the shamanic protectors, the spirits who had watched over the canyon long before any settlers had arrived. They were not here to scare or intimidate. They were here to warn, to guide. As the chanting continued, Notley noticed something strange on the ground in front of them. A circle of black feathers had appeared, forming a perfect ring around where they knelt. Each feather stood upright, as if planted in the earth by an unseen hand. Notley knew this was a sign, a symbol of the spirit's presence. The circle was complete, indicating that the ritual had been accepted, that the spirits were watching, listening. They finished the chant, bowing their head in gratitude, and as they did, the wind suddenly died down. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than any silence they had ever known. Notley felt compelled to move deeper into the gorge, as if something was calling to them. They stood and began to walk, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath their feet. The path led them to a hidden cave, its entrance obscured by hanging vines and thick foliage. Notley pushed the vines aside and stepped inside, the cool air wrapping around them like a cloak. The cave was small, the walls lined with ancient petroglyphs, drawings carved into the stone by hands that had long since turned to dust. The drawings depicted scenes of shamans, animals, and strange, swirling patterns that seemed to pulse with an inner light. As Notley ran their fingers over the carvings, they felt a sudden rush of energy, like a current of electricity moving through their body. The cave seemed to come alive, the petroglyphs glowing faintly, casting a soft light across the stone. In the center of the cave, a figure appeared, not made of flesh and bone, but of light and shadow, a spectral presence that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Notley's breath caught in their throat. They knew they were standing in the presence of one of the old protectors, a spirit that had walked these lands long before the first humans had arrived. The figure raised its hand, pointing toward the wall. The carvings shifted, the images moving as if they were alive, telling a story. Notley watched as the drawings depicted the creation of the canyon, the flow of the river, the rise and fall of civilizations. Then the images changed, showing scenes of fire and smoke, of men digging deep into the earth, pulling out the sacred stones, disturbing the balance. The final image was of the canyon collapsing in on itself, the river drying up, the land left barren and lifeless. Notley understood the message. The canyon was out of balance, its power disturbed by those who sought to exploit it. The spirit's warning was clear, and if the canyon's sacred forces were not respected, the consequences would be dire. Notley left the cave, the vision still burning in their mind. They knew they had been given a rare gift, a glimpse into the true history of the land, a warning that must be heeded. As they made their way back to the main trail, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the gorge. But the darkness didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt like a blanket, a protective cover drawn over the land by the spirits who watched over it. Far away in the Appalachian Mountains, another story was unfolding, connected by the same threads of ancestral wisdom and respect for the land. Wanagi, a hunter and tracker from the Cherokee communities in the east, felt a kinship with the spirits of the forest, much like I had felt with the guardian of the canyon. The Appalachian Mountains were Wanagi's home, their sacred ground, filled with its own legends and spirits. Among the most revered was Yaya Unala Dahi, the elusive forest guardian known to appear in times of great need or imbalance. Wanagi had grown up hearing tales of Yaya Unal Adahi from their own grandfather, who spoke of the spirit as a watcher, a judge of the hunters who entered the forest. The spirit wasn't seen often, and when it was said to take the form of a shadow, tall and slender, moving between the trees like smoke. Wanagi had never encountered it directly, but they had always felt its presence, a silent observer in the depths of the forest. One autumn, during a hunting trip, Wanagi felt a change in the air. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, was eerily quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath. Wanagi slowed their steps, scanning the trees, sensing that something was watching them. Out of the corner of their eye, they caught a glimpse of a shadow moving, not with the wind, but against it. It was there for a moment, then gone, like a wisp of smoke blown away. Wanagi knew it was Yaya Unaladahi, testing them, judging their intentions. They lowered their bow, letting their arrows rest at their side, and spoke softly into the stillness, reciting the ancient invocation they had been taught. The words were old, from a language spoken by the first people of these lands, a language that carried the weight of respect and reverence. As they spoke, the forest seemed to breathe again, the silence lifting. Wanagi felt the spirit's presence fade, not as a retreat, but as an acknowledgement. They had passed the test, shown the respect required by the old ways. When Wanagi returned to their village, the elders were waiting. They didn't need to ask what had happened. They saw it in Wanagi's eyes, in the quiet way they carried themselves. Wanagi's grandfather took them aside, placing a hand on their shoulder, and said simply, "The spirit came to remind us. We must never forget who watches over this land." Wanagi sat by the fire that evening, surrounded by the familiar faces of the village. The flames crackled softly, casting a warm glow on the circle of elders who had gathered. Their expressions were serene but serious, as if they already knew the significance of what had happened deep in the forest. Wanagi felt a heaviness in their heart, a feeling that they couldn't quite shake off. It wasn't fear exactly, but the weight of something much larger, a reminder that they were merely a thread in the vast tapestry of the land's ancient spirit. It was the kind of encounter that changes you, that leaves a mark on your soul even if no physical trace remains. Wanagi's grandfather leaned closer, his eyes reflecting the firelight like polished stones. He was a man of few words, but his silence was often more powerful than speech. He didn't ask for details. Instead, he simply listened as Wanagi described the moment of stillness, the shadow that had appeared without a sound, and the invocation that had come almost instinctively, as if the words were carried on the wind itself. The elders exchanged quiet glances, nodding as though they were hearing the confirmation of something they had already felt in their bones. "You met Yaya Unaladahi," the grandfather finally said, his voice low and reverent. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. He placed his hand on Wanagi's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "This is a rare gift, one that not everyone receives. The spirit does not show itself unless there is great need. It came to remind us of the balance we must keep, of the respect that is owed to these lands. This is not a message for you alone. It is a message for all of us." The words settled over the gathering like a blanket, warm and comforting, yet heavy with responsibility. The other elders nodded, their faces lined with years of wisdom and the unspoken understanding of what it meant to be a guardian of the old ways. They knew that the land was alive, that every tree, every stream, and every mountain had a spirit watching over it. It was a delicate balance, one that had been maintained for centuries, but was now under threat not from natural forces but from the greed and ignorance of those who did not understand its sacredness. Wanagi took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and burden. They had passed the spirit's test, but the encounter had left them with a sense of urgency, a feeling that something was coming, a change that could disrupt the harmony of the land. The elders discussed this quietly among themselves, their voices a murmur in the night, blending with the sound of the forest that had come alive again after the encounter. The birds had returned, their songs mingling with the crackle of the fire, as if the very earth was breathing a sigh of relief. The following morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the treetops, Wanagi set out on a journey to a sacred site deep in the mountains, a place known only to the most trusted members of the community. It was a spot where the shamanic rituals were performed, where the spirits of the ancestors were said to gather, and where the veil between the worlds was thinnest. The path was rugged and overgrown, untouched by human hands for years, but Wanagi knew it well. They had walked this trail many times as a child, following their grandfather and listening to his stories about the spirits that lived in the rocks and streams. When Wanagi arrived, they found a small circular clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. In the center of the clearing was a stone altar, weathered by time and covered in a soft layer of moss. It was here that the old rituals took place, where offerings were made, and where the connection to the spirit world was at its strongest. Wanagi knelt before the altar, placing a small bundle of tobacco, sage, and sweetgrass on the stone. They lit the sage, letting the smoke rise into the cool morning air, carrying their prayers with it. The scent of the burning herbs filled the clearing, a smell that always reminded Wanagi of home, of the teachings of the elders and of the stories told by firelight. Wanagi closed their eyes and began to speak, not in the modern language, but in the old tongue, the language of the first people. The words came naturally, as if they had been imprinted in their mind long before they were born. They spoke of gratitude for the land, for the spirits who watched over it, and for the guidance they had received. They asked for protection, not just for themselves, but for the entire community, for the animals of the forest and for the trees that stood like ancient sentinels around them. As they prayed, Wanagi felt a shift in the air, a subtle change that signaled the presence of the spirit. They opened their eyes and saw a shadow moving through the trees, a figure just on the edge of their vision. It was Yaya Unal Adahi, the forest guardian, standing silently among the pines. The figure didn't move closer, but it watched, its form blending with the shadows of the forest, almost as if it were a part of the trees themselves. Wanagi lowered their head in respect, holding their breath, not wanting to break the sacred moment. The spirit raised one hand as if in a gesture of blessing, then slowly vanished into the forest, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in its wake. Wanagi sat there for a long time, feeling the energy of the encounter settle into their bones, a warm, tingling sensation that spread from the top of their head to the tips of their fingers. They knew they had been given a sign, a confirmation that the old ways still held power, that the spirits were still watching and that they had not been forgotten. Wanagi returned to the village, their heart lighter, their spirit renewed. The encounter had given them a new sense of purpose, a reminder of their role as a protector of the land and its traditions. They gathered the children of the village around them, telling them the story of the forest guardian, passing on the teachings as their own grandfather had once done for them. The children listened with wide eyes, their faces filled with wonder and awe. They might not have understood everything, but the seed had been planted. They would remember the story, carry it with them, and one day, they too would stand before the spirits of the land, offering their prayers and respect. The following night, the village held a small ceremony, a gathering of the community to honor the encounter and to give thanks for the guidance they had received. The drumming began softly, a slow, steady beat that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. The people danced around the fire, their movements fluid and graceful, a celebration of life and a prayer for the future. Wanagi joined the circle, feeling the rhythm of the drums vibrate through their body, grounding them in the present moment while also connecting them to the past, to the generations who had danced the same dance under the same stars. As the night wore on, the fire burned down to glowing embers, and the drumming slowed, becoming softer, like a lullaby for the land. The elders stood together, watching the sky, their faces turned up to the moon which hung low and full, casting a silver light over the trees. Wanagi stood with them, feeling the cool breeze on their face, the scent of pine and smoke in the air. It was a moment of peace, a brief respite in the never-ending cycle of life. The sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and the people slowly made their way back to their homes, leaving the clearing empty and silent once more. Wanagi lingered for a moment, watching as the last wisp of smoke from the fire drifted up into the sky, disappearing into the morning light. They felt a deep sense of contentment, a feeling that everything was as it should be, at least for now. They knew that the challenges were not over, that the balance of the land would need constant tending, but they also knew that they were not alone in this task. The spirits were with them, just as they had always been, guiding, watching, protecting. As Wanagi turned to leave, they glanced back one last time and saw a single black feather lying on the ground, right where the spirit had stood. It was a sign, a gift, a reminder of the encounter and the sacred bond that had been reaffirmed. Wanagi picked up the feather, holding it gently in their hand, feeling the soft, delicate texture of the quill. They smiled, tucking the feather into their pouch, knowing it would be a symbol of the lesson they had learned and the legacy they would carry forward for themselves, for their children, and for the land that had given them everything.